Ruth Carter was wiping spilled champagne from the marble aisle when the bride looked down and laughed, not knowing the man watching from the balcony above could end the wedding with a single sentence. The Belmont Grand had been transformed into a cathedral of money by noon. Every inch of the ballroom dressed in white roses, gold chairs, silk ribbons, and crystal chandeliers that threw soft light over 500 guests. A string quartet played near the fountain. Champagne towers gleamed beside the entrance. Cameras waited at the end of the aisle, pointed toward a ceremony designed to look effortless, though Ruth knew nothing about beauty that expensive was ever effortless. She had been there since 6 in the morning, carrying buckets, polishing glass, changing trash liners, and cleaning footprints from the marble before anyone important arrived. Her black uniform was plain, her hair pinned neatly back, her name tag clipped straight over her heart. She moved quietly, because quiet was safer in places where workers were noticed only when something went wrong. The spill happened near the front row, a thin splash of champagne on white marble, bright and dangerous beneath the flower arch. Ruth dropped to one knee with her cloth before a guest could slip, working quickly, carefully, hoping to disappear before the bridal party entered. Then the room shifted. Madison Whitfield stepped into the aisle in a wedding gown that shimmered with hand-sewn pearls, her blonde hair arranged beneath a veil so long it trailed behind her like a cloud. 4 bridesmaids followed her, all pale silk, perfect makeup, and practiced smiles. Madison stopped when she saw Ruth near her feet. For 1 second, there was no sound except the quartet and the soft sweep of the veil against the floor. Then Madison laughed. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was delicate, polished, meant to make cruelty sound expensive. "You are just a cleaner," she said, looking down at Ruth as if the words were a fact of architecture. "Do not stand where beautiful people are supposed to walk." One bridesmaid covered her mouth. Another let out a small laugh that gave the others permission. A few guests turned their heads. Ruth's hand tightened around the damp cloth. She could smell champagne, roses, floor polish, and the faint perfume of people who had never wondered whether rent would clear before payday. She did not answer. She only lowered her eyes to the marble and finished wiping the spill, because the ballroom manager had warned every staff member that this wedding mattered. The Whitfield family mattered. The Hale family mattered. One complaint from the bride could cost someone a job. Madison tilted her head, irritated by Ruth's silence. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "Staff should be invisible today." Ruth rose slowly, keeping the cloth folded in her hand. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I will be out of the way in a moment." That should have ended it. But cruelty, once applauded, always looks for an encore. Madison stepped closer, her smile sharpening. "Out of the way means the service hall, sweetheart. Not the aisle. Not the photographs. Not anywhere people will remember." The bridesmaids laughed again, softer now, because even they sensed the words had crossed into something colder. Ruth felt heat climb her face, but her shoulders stayed square. She had spent too many years watching her mother bend, without breaking, to let one bride make her crumble before lunch. High above them, on the second-floor balcony, Dominic Hale stood behind the carved railing with a glass of water in his hand. He was a white man in a black suit, still as a shadow against the gold wall, his face unreadable beneath the chandelier light. He had come early to watch his nephew marry into power. Instead, he watched the woman chosen for that family measure a black cleaner by the uniform she wore. Dominic did not move. He did not speak. But the glass in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth, and his eyes settled on Madison Whitfield with the cold attention of a door locking from the inside. Ruth Carter had not planned to be seen at all that day. Being unseen was part of the job at the Belmont Grand. As ordinary as the gray cleaning cart, she pushed through service halls and the key ring that clicked against her hip with every step. She had learned the rhythm of the hotel the way other people learned songs, which elevators guests used, which doors opened into kitchens, which corridors smelled faintly of lilies after expensive weddings, which supervisors said please only when important people were nearby. That morning, she had arrived before sunrise with coffee in a paper cup and pain in both feet from the hospital shift she had finished only 3 hours earlier. At Mercy General, she cleaned patient rooms from 7 at night until 2 in the morning, changing trash, wiping rails, and whispering good luck to strangers who never knew her name. Then she rode the train home, slept for 1 hour in a chair beside her mother's bed, changed into her hotel uniform, and came to Belmont before the city had fully woken up. She did it because Lorraine Carter needed medication that insurance never seemed to cover completely, and because Marcus, Ruth's 8-year-old nephew, needed lunch money, school shoes, and someone to believe his drawings of rockets could one day become more than paper taped to a refrigerator. Ruth's apartment in Queens was small, but it was clean. Her mother had taught her that cleanliness was not about impressing people. It was about claiming peace where the world tried to leave disorder. Lorraine had once worked in houses where chandeliers hung over rooms larger than their entire home, and she never came back ashamed. "Honest work never lowers you," she used to tell Ruth, folding her uniform with careful hands. "Only dishonest hearts look down." Ruth carried those words in the pocket of her life, right beside the old photograph tucked inside her hotel vest. In the picture, Lorraine was younger, standing outside a brick mansion Ruth did not recognize, wearing a maid's uniform and holding a little boy's hand. Ruth had asked about it once, years ago. Lorraine had only smiled sadly and said, "Some debts are not paid with money, baby. Some are paid by remembering who helped you stand." Ruth had not understood. She had stopped asking when her mother's breathing grew weaker and memory started arriving in pieces. Now, standing in the Belmont ballroom while Madison Whitfield's laughter still hung in the air, Ruth felt that photograph like a small weight against her chest. She wanted to reach for it, but she did not. Instead, she stepped back from the aisle and folded the damp cloth over her wrist. Madison watched her with the satisfaction of someone who believed silence meant surrender. "Good," the bride said. "See? She can follow instructions." A few bridesmaids smiled. One guest lifted a phone, pretending to check a message while aiming the camera too carefully. Ruth noticed. So did Dominic Hale from the balcony. Ruth's face warmed, but her voice remained even. "The spill is clean, ma'am. No one will slip now." For a moment, Madison seemed annoyed that the answer contained dignity instead of fear. "How thoughtful," she said. "The hotel must be proud." Ruth lowered her gaze, not in defeat, but to keep herself from giving the room the reaction it wanted. She thought of Marcus at the kitchen table that morning, drawing a rocket in blue crayon and asking if rich people had bigger moons. She had told him the moon belonged to everyone. She needed to believe that now. The aisle, the roses, the chandeliers, the cameras, none of them belonged to Madison more than Ruth's dignity belonged to Ruth. Still, losing the hotel job would hurt. Losing it before rent was due would hurt worse. So she turned toward the service hallway, intending to leave with what grace she could salvage. Behind her, Madison's voice followed, light and cruel. "Next time, send someone who understands elegance." Ruth stopped for half a breath. Then she kept walking. Above the ballroom, Dominic Hale finally lowered the glass from his hand. He had seen many things in his life that disappointed him, but nothing chilled him quite like watching an honest worker protect others while the powerful mocked her for it. The service hallway behind the ballroom was narrow, bright, and cold, with white walls that made every sound sharper. Ruth pushed her cleaning cart toward the storage room, telling herself to breathe slowly, telling herself that Madison Whitfield was not the first wealthy woman to mistake a uniform for permission. But the laughter followed her anyway. It clung to the back of her neck, slid under her collar, and settled somewhere old. She parked the cart beside a stack of folded chair covers and pressed both hands against the handle until her knuckles steadied. In the pocket of her vest, the photograph of her mother seemed to burn through the fabric. Ruth took it out before she could stop herself. Lorraine Carter stood in the faded picture with her shoulders straight and her hair pinned neatly back, one hand resting on the shoulder of a young white boy in a dark coat. Behind them was a brick mansion dusted with snow. Ruth had never known why her mother kept the picture in a kitchen drawer wrapped in tissue, only that Lorraine touched it sometimes when the bills got bad, as if it reminded her that their lives had contained more than struggle. Ruth traced the edge of her mother's face with her thumb. "Honest work never lowers you," she whispered. Then the ballroom doors opened again. Madison entered the hallway with two bridesmaids behind her, carrying the sharp smell of perfume and flowers into the service corridor. Ruth slipped the photograph back into her pocket and straightened. Madison's smile returned the moment she realized there was no audience large enough to restrain her, only enough witnesses to entertain her. "There you are," she said. "I was beginning to think you had vanished, which would have been perfect." Ruth kept her voice level. "Do you need something cleaned, ma'am?" One bridesmaid giggled. Madison lifted her bouquet, inspected it, then let 3 white roses fall deliberately onto the floor near Ruth's cart. Pick those up. Carefully. They cost more than your shift. Ruth looked at the roses on the tile. Her first instinct was to obey because obedience kept paychecks alive. She bent and picked them up one by one, gently, because flowers did not deserve contempt just because a cruel hand had dropped them. Madison watched, disappointed that Ruth did not rush or tremble. You are very calm for someone in your position. Ruth stood and held the roses out. My position is employee, ma'am, not entertainment. The sentence was quiet, but it changed the hallway. One bridesmaid looked away. The other stopped smiling. Madison's eyes narrowed, the pearls on her dress catching the overhead lights like tiny hard moons. Careful, she said. Women like you lose jobs for less than that. Ruth's heart beat hard, but her mother's words stood behind her like a hand at her back. Women like me keep places like this running, she said. We clean the rooms, carry the linens, empty the trash, and make sure beautiful days stay beautiful for people who never learn our names. Madison's face flushed, not with shame, with anger at being answered by someone she had decided should not have a voice. Do not lecture me. I am not lecturing you, Ruth said. I am asking you to let me do my work. The bridesmaid with the phone lifted it again, but this time her hand shook. She no longer looked amused. The moment had stopped being a joke and become a record. Madison stepped close enough for Ruth to see the tiny diamonds sewn into the neckline of her gown, each one glittering under service hall lights never meant for photographs. Listen to me, Madison said softly. In 1 hour, I will be Mrs. Ethan Hale. Do you understand what that means in this hotel? Ruth looked at her for a long second. It means you are getting married. The simplicity of the answer struck harder than disrespect. Madison inhaled sharply, then turned toward the ballroom. Ethan will hear about this. Ruth's stomach tightened. Losing a job because of a bride's pride was not dramatic. It was practical. It meant overdue rent, cheaper medicine, Marcus pretending not to need new shoes. But she did not apologize. She could not. From the far end of the hallway, unseen by Madison, Dominic Hale stood in the open doorway near the staff elevator. He had followed without sound, and now he watched his future niece-in-law threaten a cleaner for refusing to be made small. He had not heard every word from the balcony. Now he had heard enough. His face changed by almost nothing, but the air around him seemed to grow colder. Ruth turned and saw him. For one heartbeat, she thought he had come to fire her. Instead, Dominic's eyes dropped to the pocket where the corner of the old photograph still showed, and something in his expression went still in a different way. Recognition arrived before he spoke. Dominic Hale did not announce himself. He did not need to. The service hallway changed the moment Ruth saw him standing near the staff elevator, one hand resting at his side, his black suit untouched by the frantic brightness of the wedding morning. Madison turned only when she noticed Ruth's eyes shift past her shoulder. For half a second, irritation stayed on the bride's face. Then she recognized the man in the doorway, and the color beneath her makeup changed. Mr. Hale, she said, forcing a smile too quickly. I did not realize you were there. Dominic looked at her as if the sentence had answered a question he had not asked. That seems to be a pattern today. One bridesmaid lowered her phone. The other stared at the floor. Ruth stood beside the cleaning cart with the fallen roses in her hand, feeling the old fear rise through her chest. Rich families did not usually correct other rich families for the sake of women in uniforms. They protected the room, the photographs, the ceremony, the money already spent. Ruth braced herself for polite dismissal, for a quiet instruction to avoid the bride, for the kind of apology given only to make workers leave faster. Instead, Dominic's eyes moved again to the photograph half hidden in her vest pocket. His voice, when it came, was low and careful. May I see that? Ruth blinked. Sir. The photograph. Madison's smile tightened. Dominic, surely this is not the time for staff keepsakes. He did not look at her. That was worse than anger. Ruth hesitated, then slowly removed the faded picture and held it out. Dominic took it with both hands, and the hallway seemed to narrow around the image. The young boy in the photograph had pale eyes, a dark coat, and a guarded expression too serious for his age. The woman beside him, Lorraine Carter, stood upright in a maid's uniform, one hand placed protectively on his shoulder. Dominic stared at it for so long that Ruth forgot the roses in her hand. Where did you get this? He asked. It was my mother's, Ruth said quietly. Lorraine Carter. At the name, Dominic's face went still in a way that stripped the hallway of every careless sound. Even Madison stopped breathing for a moment. Lorraine, he repeated, and the name did not sound like memory. It sounded like debt. Ruth searched his face. You knew her? Dominic looked from the photograph to Ruth, and for the first time since he appeared, the coldness in his eyes cracked enough to reveal something older. She kept me alive when I was 22. Madison gave a nervous little laugh, as if the sentence was too serious to be allowed. That is dramatic. Dominic finally turned to her. No. Dramatic is building a wedding on flowers, cameras, and empty manners while insulting the daughter of a woman this family owes more than money. Madison's mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. Ruth felt the hallway tilt around her. Her mother had never told the story, not fully, only fragments. A storm, a young man with nowhere safe to go, a family that had forgotten how to protect its own. Dominic looked back at the photograph. Your mother worked in my father's house before I had anything of my own. During the worst winter of my life, she hid me in a laundry room, brought me food, called the only person she trusted, and never asked for a single favor afterward. Ruth's eyes burned. In her mind, she saw Lorraine younger, stronger, moving through some grand house with quiet courage, doing what needed to be done while powerful people failed each other. Madison shifted, trying to recover the room. I did not know any of that. Dominic's reply came softly. You did not need to know her history to treat her daughter like a human being. The sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have. Ruth looked down at the roses in her hand, their white petals perfect despite being dropped. She thought of her mother folding uniforms at the kitchen table, telling her honest work never lowers you. She had thought those words were comfort. Now she understood they were testimony. From the ballroom, the quartet began the first notes of the processional. Guests stirred beyond the doors. The wedding was ready to begin. Dominic handed the photograph back to Ruth with a care that made Madison look smaller than her gown. Then he stepped toward the ballroom entrance. Come, he said. Madison exhaled in relief, thinking the moment had passed. But Dominic did not mean her. He looked at Ruth. You should be present for what happens next. Ruth Carter did not move at first. The word present felt too large for a woman who had spent most of her life being asked to disappear. Madison stared at Dominic as if she had misheard him, one hand tightening around the bouquet she had reclaimed. Dominic, she cannot walk into the ballroom with us, she said, her voice low and urgent now. The ceremony is starting. Dominic opened the ballroom doors without touching the argument. Warm music, candlelight, and the scent of white roses poured into the service hallway. 500 guests turned toward the entrance, expecting a bride arranged like a dream. Instead, they saw Dominic Hale step in first, face calm, black suit severe against the brightness, followed by Ruth in her plain cleaning uniform, a damp cloth folded over one wrist, and an old photograph held carefully against her chest. The quartet faltered. One violin lost the melody for a breath, then stopped completely. Silence spread from the first row to the back of the ballroom like a curtain being drawn. Ethan Hale stood beneath the flower arch, handsome and pale, his boutonniere pinned perfectly, his smile fading as he saw his uncle. Madison entered behind them, no longer floating. Her dress still glittered, her veil still trailed across the marble, but the room could feel that something had slipped out of her control. Dominic walked down the aisle slowly, not as part of the ceremony, but as if he were measuring every foot of marble Ruth had been told she did not belong on. Ruth followed because turning back would have made her mother's photograph heavier. Guests whispered. Phones lifted, then lowered when Dominic's eyes passed over them. At the front, Ethan tried to laugh softly, the way rich men laugh when they want discomfort to become harmless. Uncle Dominic, he said, whatever this is, can it wait until after the vows? Dominic stopped 3 feet from him. No, one word. The whole ballroom heard it. Ethan swallowed. Madison is upset. I am sure there was a misunderstanding. Ruth looked at him then, not with anger, with disappointment, so quiet it nearly vanished. He had heard enough in the hallway to know there had been no misunderstanding. He simply wanted the truth to become inconvenient later. Dominic saw that too. You watched her insult an employee in front of your guests, Dominic said. You watched her threaten this woman's job, and your concern was timing. Ethan's face flushed. This is my wedding. That is why it matters. Madison stepped forward, forcing a tremulous smile for the crowd. Everyone, please, this is just stress. Weddings bring out emotion. I made a careless comment to a staff member, and I apologize if it sounded harsh. The word "if" moved through the room like a stain. Ruth felt it. Dominic felt it. Even some guests shifted in their seats. Dominic turned his head toward Madison. Do not call cruelty stress. Madison's smile collapsed. He faced the quartet and lifted one hand. No more music. Then he looked toward the officiant. Close the book. A murmur broke across the ballroom. Ethan took a step forward. You cannot do this. Dominic's voice stayed low. I can. But more importantly, I should. He reached into his jacket and removed a small silver pin bearing the Hale family crest from Ethan's lapel. The gesture was careful, almost gentle, and far more devastating because of it. A man who lets cruelty pass in silence is not ready to build a family under my name. Ethan stared at the pin in Dominic's hand, as if watching a future disappear. Madison's father rose from the front row, face tight with outrage, but Dominic did not even glance at him. All his attention returned to Ruth. He held up the old photograph, just enough for the nearest rows to see Lorraine Carter standing beside the young man he used to be. Before anyone in this room speaks of class, remember this. Some people inherit chandeliers. Some people keep them shining. And sometimes, the ones cleaning the floor are the reason the rest of us are still standing. The ballroom went silent again, but this silence was different. It no longer belonged to shock. It belonged to shame. Madison Whitfield stood in the center of the aisle with 500 eyes on her and nowhere elegant left to hide. The gown that had made her look untouchable moments earlier now seemed too bright for the person wearing it. Every pearl catching the chandelier light, while her face struggled to hold its shape. This is humiliating, she whispered, though the room was quiet enough for the front rows to hear. Dominic Hale looked at her without blinking. Yes, he said. That is usually how it feels when dignity is taken in public. Ruth's fingers tightened around her mother's photograph. She had not asked for this. She had not imagined standing in front of a wedding crowd while powerful people unraveled around her. Part of her wanted to hand back the photograph, return to the service hallway, and let the marble swallow the whole scene. But another part, the part Lorraine Carter had raised carefully through rent notices and double shifts, understood that leaving too soon would make the lesson smaller than the wound. Madison turned to the guests, searching for sympathy. I made a mistake, she said, her voice trembling now. I was under pressure. Every bride is under pressure. Dominic's reply came before the excuse could settle. Pressure reveals what is inside. It does not invent it. Madison's father, Charles Whitfield, stepped from the front row with his jaw set and his tuxedo jacket buttoned too tightly across his chest. Dominic, this is an overreaction. My daughter has been insulted in front of everyone. Dominic finally looked at him. Your daughter insulted a woman who was working to keep her guests safe from slipping on spilled champagne. Charles hesitated, and in that hesitation, the room understood how little defense there was. Dominic continued, his voice level. She did not protect beauty today. She protected vanity. There is a difference. Ethan Hale stood beneath the arch, staring at the family crest pin in his uncle's hand, as if it weighed more than silver. Uncle, please, he said quietly. We can talk about this privately. You had privacy in the hallway, Dominic said. You used it to stay silent. The words struck Ethan harder than any accusation shouted across the room. Ruth saw it in his face. He was not cruel like Madison, not exactly. He was worse in a quieter way. He had trained himself to let cruelty pass as long as it did not cost him comfort. Dominic turned to the hotel manager near the sidewall. Mr. Coleman, remove the ceremony schedule from the ballroom. This event is over. Mr. Coleman looked once at Madison, once at Ethan, then bowed his head. Yes, Mr. Hale. A ripple passed through the room as staff members moved with careful professionalism, closing the guest book, collecting programs, guiding musicians away from their stands. No one rushed. No one shouted. The ending arrived with the terrible politeness of a door being locked. Madison's veil trembled against her shoulders. You cannot cancel my wedding because of a cleaner. Ruth flinched despite herself, not from fear, but from hearing the word thrown one more time like a dirty coin. Dominic stepped toward Madison, stopping at a respectful distance. No, he said. I am canceling it because even now, you still do not know what you did wrong. That silenced her. Not completely, but deeply enough that her mouth closed around the next excuse. Dominic faced the guests again. Lorraine Carter once risked everything for this family when she had no reason to. Her daughter came here today to do honest work and was treated as if labor made her less worthy of respect. He lowered the photograph and looked at Ethan. If this marriage begins with that kind of blindness, it will end with this family forgetting what saved it. Ruth felt tears rise, but she did not let them fall. Not yet. The ballroom lights glowed over roses, gold chairs, and faces no longer sure where to look. Then Dominic turned to Ruth, and his voice changed. The steel remained, but it no longer pointed at her. Miss Carter, you owe no one in this room an apology for being here. The sentence moved through her slowly, like warmth returning to cold hands. For years, Ruth had entered beautiful rooms through side doors and left before applause began. Now every person in the ballroom had to see her standing in the aisle. Uniform plain, cloth over her wrist, her mother's photograph held close, and nothing about her looked small. For several seconds after Dominic spoke, Ruth Carter could hear nothing but the soft hum of the ballroom lights and the faint rustle of guests who no longer knew how to sit comfortably inside their own silence. Madison Whitfield's hands tightened around her bouquet until the stems bent beneath the ribbon. I already said it was wedding stress, she whispered. Dominic looked at her with the patience of a man watching someone choose the wrong door twice. You explained yourself, he said. You did not apologize. Madison's eyes flicked toward Ruth, then away again, as if looking directly at the woman she had wounded made the room harder to breathe in. Charles Whitfield stepped closer to his daughter, but Dominic raised one hand, calm and final. No one speaks for her now. The words stopped him where he stood. Ruth felt every gaze return to her, and for one brief moment, the old instinct rose again. Make it easier for them. Accept the smallest apology. Leave before they blame you for the discomfort. But then she thought of Lorraine Carter folding uniforms at the kitchen table, Marcus asking if the moon belonged to rich people, and the photograph pressed against her palm. She had not caused this. She had simply refused to disappear inside it. Madison swallowed, her voice thinner now. Miss Carter, she said, the name sounding unfamiliar in her mouth. I am sorry if my words offended you. Dominic's expression did not change, but the whole room seemed to feel the failure of that sentence. Ruth did not answer right away. She looked at the bride, not with hatred, not with triumph, but with the exhaustion of someone who had heard too many apologies shaped like escape routes. You are not sorry that I was offended, Ruth said quietly. You are sorry that everyone heard you. A murmur moved through the guests, then died quickly. Madison's face flushed. For the first time all day, she looked less like a bride and more like a person being asked to meet herself without decoration. Ruth continued, her voice still soft, still steady. I came here to clean a spill so no one would fall. That was my job. You turned it into a reason to laugh. My work is not shameful. My uniform is not shameful. My mother's work was not shameful. And if you cannot see that, the problem is not what I am wearing. The words did not fill the ballroom. They clarified it. Madison stared at Ruth, and something in her posture collapsed, not dramatically, but enough for honesty to pass through. I am sorry, she said again, slower this time. I was cruel. I treated you like you were beneath me because I thought this day made me untouchable. It did not. I am sorry, Miss Carter. Ruth listened. The apology was better. Not complete, perhaps, but less poisoned. She nodded once, not to forgive everything, but to place the burden back where it belonged. Dominic turned to Ethan. And you? Ethan looked startled, as if silence had hidden him until that moment. Ruth watched him struggle with pride, embarrassment, and the terrible discovery that doing nothing had become visible. Miss Carter, Ethan said, his voice low. I heard enough to know I should have stopped it. I did not. I am sorry. Dominic held his gaze. Remember that apology. It is the first honest thing you have said today. The ballroom stayed still. Then Dominic faced Mr. Coleman. The guests may leave through the main lobby. The staff will not use the back corridors to avoid their discomfort. Mr. Coleman nodded quickly. Yes, Mr. Hale. Madison lowered her bouquet. Ethan removed the boutonniere from his lapel and held it in his hand like something that no longer belonged to him. Ruth finally let one tear slip down her cheek, but her chin did not lower. Dominic stepped beside her, not in front of her, and spoke to the room with quiet authority. The ceremony is over. The lesson is not. The guests began to leave slowly, not with the bright chatter of people exiting a wedding, but with the careful quiet of people walking away from a mirror they had not wanted to face. Programs remained folded on chairs. White roses bowed under the warm ballroom lights. The aisle that had been prepared for vows now stretched empty between two rows of silent witnesses. Ruth Carter stood near the front with the damp cloth still over her wrist, feeling the strange weight of being seen without being mocked. Madison Whitfield had been escorted to a private sitting room by her bridesmaids, her veil gathered in their hands like a cloud that had lost its sky. Ethan remained near the flower arch, staring at the floor where the ceremony should have begun, his family crest pin gone from his lapel. Dominic Hale did not look satisfied. Men like him understood victory, but this was not victory. This was correction, and correction always left broken glass somewhere. He turned to Mr. Coleman, the hotel manager, who stood pale and rigid beside the first row. "Bring the staff in," Dominic said. "All of them." Mr. Coleman blinked. "Sir, the people who made this room possible." Within minutes, dishwashers, servers, housekeepers, florists, porters, cooks, and maintenance workers gathered near the ballroom doors, uncertain whether they had been summoned for praise or punishment. Many still wore gloves. One carried a tray towel. Another had flour on his sleeve. Ruth saw their faces and felt a pull behind her ribs. These were the people who moved through luxury before dawn and after midnight, making beauty appear effortless for guests who rarely wondered who polished the glass. Dominic stepped aside, so Ruth was not hidden behind him. "Today," he said, "this room forgot who held it together." No one spoke. Even the staff seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Dominic looked at them, then back at the aisle. Miss Carter was told she did not belong where beautiful people walk. That was wrong. He turned to Ruth. "You will leave this ballroom through the main aisle. Not the service hallway. Not the side door. The main aisle." Ruth's eyes widened. "Mr. Hale, I do not need that." "I know," he said gently. "That is why it matters." The words reached places money never could. Mr. Coleman straightened, understanding at last. He gestured to the staff, and they formed two quiet lines along the aisle, not staged, not decorative, simply present. Ruth looked at them, then at the white flowers beneath the arch, then at the photograph of her mother in her hand. Lorraine Carter had spent her life entering grand rooms from the back. Ruth thought of her apartment in Queens, of Marcus drawing rockets, of her mother's breathing beside the bed, of every worker who had ever been told to vanish once the room looked perfect. She placed the damp cloth on a nearby table. Slowly, she stepped onto the aisle. Her black work shoes touched the same marble Madison had claimed for beauty, and nothing shattered. No chandelier dimmed. No rose lost its color. Ruth walked forward in her plain uniform, shoulders straight, photograph held close to her heart. As she passed, the staff lifted their heads. Some guests still near the exits turned to watch, but no one laughed now. Ethan lowered his eyes. Madison, visible through the cracked sitting room door, saw just enough to understand that the aisle she had tried to protect from a cleaner had become the cleaner's restoration. At the end, Dominic stood by the open ballroom doors. When Ruth reached him, he bowed his head, not as a performance, but as a debt finally remembered. "Miss Carter," he said, "please tell your mother that Dominic Hale never forgot." Ruth's lips trembled. "She will know," she whispered. And for the first time that day, the ballroom felt clean. That evening, Ruth Carter returned to Queens with the photograph tucked safely inside her coat and the damp cloth no longer in her hand. The train ride felt different, though the seats were the same hard plastic and the windows still reflected tired faces under fluorescent light. She had left the Belmont Grand through the main lobby, not the service hallway, passing marble columns, gold-framed mirrors, and guests who stepped aside without being asked. No applause followed her. She was grateful for that. Applause would have made it feel like a show. Silence made it feel real. At home, Marcus ran to the door in socks, holding his blue crayon rocket drawing. "Aunt Ruth, did the wedding have a cake taller than me?" Ruth laughed for the first time all day, soft and surprised. "Almost." In the bedroom, Lorraine Carter sat propped against pillows, thinner than the woman in the old photograph, but still carrying the same straight-backed dignity in her eyes. Ruth knelt beside her and placed the picture on the blanket. "Mama," she whispered, "I met the boy." Lorraine looked down at the photograph, then closed her eyes as if a long hallway inside her memory had finally lit up. "Dominic," she said. Ruth nodded. For a while, neither woman spoke. Some stories did not need to be retold all at once. They only needed to be believed. The next morning, a black car did not come to make Ruth feel bought. No cameras arrived. No reporters called. Instead, Mr. Coleman from the Belmont Grand called personally to tell her that her position was secure, her hospital schedule would be accommodated, and a staff dignity policy would be written with employee input before the end of the week. Later, an envelope arrived from Dominic Hale, addressed not to Ruth alone, but to Lorraine Carter. Inside was a handwritten letter, a medical care arrangement for Lorraine through a private home health program, and a simple note at the bottom. "This is not payment for what you did. Some debts are too sacred to reduce to money. This is remembrance." Ruth read it aloud twice because Lorraine asked her to, and the second time, her mother cried without shame. Across town, the Belmont Grand changed in quieter ways. The service hallway doors were repainted. Staff names were added to event briefings. Mr. Coleman began every wedding meeting by introducing the workers who would make the day possible. Madison Whitfield disappeared from society pages for a while, and Ethan Hale spent months outside family business, not as punishment alone, but as distance enough to learn what silence had cost him. Dominic returned to the ballroom 1 week later, after the roses were gone and the chandeliers were being cleaned. He stood at the end of the aisle where Ruth had walked, looking at the marble that had held both insult and restoration. Then he turned to the staff gathered for a morning briefing and said, "No one who works here enters through shame." The words were not loud, but they traveled. Ruth kept working. She still cleaned rooms, still rode the train, still packed Marcus's lunch, still sat beside her mother at night. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer mistook being tired for being small. The cloth in her hand was still a cloth. The uniform was still a uniform. The work was still work. Yet whenever Ruth walked into a bright room where someone forgot to see her, she remembered the white aisle, the silent guests, Dominic Hale lowering his head, and her mother's photograph warm against her heart. And that day, everyone at Belmont Grand learned that no honest worker is ever just anything.